The woman who gave her cells to science without her consent and changed the world forever. Imagine two photographs. The first, a faded, simple portrait of a young black woman with an arresting smile and kind, confident eyes. She is wearing a print dress, and a slight tilt to her head suggests a quick wit and a loving heart. She died in 1951, impoverished, buried in an unmarked grave on a dusty Virginia farm. The second photograph, however, is not a person. It is a cluster of swirling, pulsing entities, transparent, relentless, and teeming with life. They are Henrietta Lacks's cells, and they are everywhere. They were used to create the polio vaccine, map the human genome, develop AIDS treatments, and travel to the moon. They have multiplied into a mass that literally outweighs the woman they came from, and they have generated untold billions for the scientific and pharmaceutical industries. How did one woman, born in the segregated American South, become a ghost in the machine of modern medicine? How did her body, taken without her knowledge or permission, launch the biological revolution, while her children were left in poverty, unable to afford health insurance? This is the astonishing, ethically complex, and deeply human story of Henrietta Lacks, a woman whose silent contribution changed the world, and whose identity became the epicenter of a furious debate over race, rights, and the very definition of consent in the name of science. Henrietta Lacks began her life far from the antiseptic laboratories of modern science, born as Loretta Pleasant on August 1, 1920, in Roanoke, Virginia. The minor mystery of her name, Loretta becoming Henrietta, was the first small piece of her identity to be subtly altered long before her cells gained their own new moniker. Her childhood was defined by the deep red soil of Clover, Virginia, a small unincorporated community in Halifax County. Following the premature death of her mother, Eliza, when Henrietta was just 4, she and her siblings were dispersed among relatives. Henrietta was sent to live with her maternal grandfather, Tommy Lacks, in the same weathered 4-room log cabin that had once served as the slave quarters on the Lacks family's ancestral land. The environment was rugged, demanding, and steeped in the legacy of American slavery. The cabin had no indoor plumbing or electricity. Running water meant a trip to the well. Life was a perpetual cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting tobacco. Henrietta's formal education was fleeting, lasting only until the 6th grade, before the farm demanded her full-time labor. She was highly intelligent, but her wisdom was learned from the earth and the communal life of her kin. It was here, in the midst of this postural labor, that she grew up alongside her first cousin, David Day Lacks. Their relationship evolved from childhood companionship to a deep, lifelong romance. They married in 1941, already having had 2 children, Lawrence and Elsie. Their bond was one of mutual support, forged in the heat of the South, yet strained by the economic realities of Jim Crow. The Great Migration drew millions of black families north or to industrial southern cities, seeking better wages and a respite from the most brutal aspects of agricultural racism. For Day and Henrietta, this meant Baltimore, Maryland. 1943. Day secured a coveted, albeit dangerous, job at the Bethlehem Steel Plant in Sparrows Point. He became a pusher, working with molten metal and high heat for 12 hours a day. The family settled in Turner Station, a dense, self-sufficient black community that sprang up around the steel mill. Turner Station was a vibrant contrast to Clover. It was a place where black people owned homes, ran small businesses, and forged a collective identity. Henrietta embraced the change. She was known for her vitality, her sharp dressing, and her passion for dancing. She was a meticulous homemaker and a loving, fierce mother to her growing family. Sonny, Deborah, and Joseph, later named Zachariah, were born between 1945 and 1950, rounding out their household to 5 lively children. Life in Turner Station was challenging, but hopeful. However, the shadow of segregation still loomed, especially over health care. Johns Hopkins Hospital, a world-renowned medical institution, operated the only ward in the area that would reliably treat poor black patients. It was a hospital of last resort, a place where patients knew they would receive care, but often at the expense of their dignity or their privacy. In late 1950, Henrietta Lacks began to experience troubling symptoms, unusual bleeding, and a knot in her womb. For a robust woman of 30 who had recently given birth, the symptoms were alarming. On January 29, 1951, Henrietta Lacks presented herself at the colored gynecology clinic at Johns Hopkins. A resident examined her and found a suspicious mass, a dark purplish growth on her cervix that bled easily. A biopsy was taken and sent to the pathology lab. The diagnosis was swift and devastating: a malignant, aggressive epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix. In the 1950s, a cancer diagnosis was often a pronouncement of death. Her treating gynecologist, Dr. Howard Jones, recommended the standard cutting-edge treatment of the time: radium therapy. This involved sewing tubes containing radium directly onto the cervix. It was a brutal procedure, often accompanied by severe side effects, but it was the best chance available. However, before the radium could be applied, 2 small tissue samples were removed from Henrietta's cervix, one from the cancerous tumor and one from the healthy tissue nearby. These samples were taken not for her own diagnosis, but for a man named Dr. George Guy, a dedicated but often overlooked researcher working in a small lab in the hospital basement. Dr. George Guy had a singular obsession: to grow human cells in culture indefinitely. For years, he and his assistant, Mary Kubitschek, had tried every concoction of nutrient broth and every piece of human tissue they could get their hands on, but every single culture had failed, dying after a few weeks. The ability to grow immortal human cells was the holy grail of tissue culture, a key to studying cancer and viruses outside the living body. The fragments of Henrietta's cervix, labeled H-Del, were placed in a culture dish. Mary Kubitschek, weary from years of failure, followed the protocol, nurturing the cells in the Guy's medium, a complex nutrient broth of chicken blood, calf serum, and human placental cord blood. Then a miracle happened. Where hundreds of previous samples had withered and died, Henrietta's cells flourished. They doubled their population every 24 hours, growing with a shocking, unprecedented aggression. They didn't just survive, they conquered the petri dish, multiplying limitlessly. Guy realized he had finally achieved the impossible: an immortal human cell line. He named them HeLa, using the first 2 letters of her first and last names. Crucially, neither Henrietta nor Day were ever informed that the tissue samples had been taken, nor were they ever asked for permission. The prevailing ethical climate at Hopkins viewed this as a routine, non-harmful extension of the surgical procedure on a public ward patient. The concept of informed consent was decades away from becoming a legal requirement. While the HeLa cells began their scientific conquest, Henrietta Lacks fought a losing battle. The cancer was relentlessly aggressive. Despite subsequent X-ray treatments and numerous painful hospital visits, the tumors metastasized throughout her body, to her liver, her lungs, and her bones. On October 4, 1951, just 8 months after her first visit to Hopkins, Henrietta Lacks died in the segregated ward of the hospital. She was 31 years old.
Children were left motherless, her husband widowed, and her legacy, unknown to them, was beginning its global ascent. Her body was returned to Clover and buried next to her mother in an unmarked grave, obscured by weeds and forgotten by the world outside her family. There was no headstone, no marker to signify the location of the woman who would become the most important accidental contributor to modern science. Dr. Guy, in his passionate desire to advance science, began distributing HeLa cells freely to researchers worldwide. He sent vials by mail, often packed in ordinary thermos flasks, to laboratories across the globe. He never sought profit, only progress. HeLa's first monumental achievement came with the fight against polio. In the early 1950s, Jonas Salk needed a reliable way to grow the polio virus to test his experimental vaccine. HeLa cells proved to be the perfect, consistent, and massive cellular factory he needed. The cells, grown at a dedicated lab in Tuskegee, Alabama, were central to the successful testing and mass production of the polio vaccine, effectively ending the childhood terror that had plagued the nation. HeLa quickly became the standard test medium for nearly all major scientific inquiries. Genetic mapping. They were instrumental in counting the correct number of human chromosomes. Drug development. They became the default tool for testing the effects of new drugs, poisons, and radiation. Virology. They were used to culture and study viruses ranging from the common cold to herpes. Space travel. HeLa cells were among the first human biological materials sent into space to study the effects of zero gravity. But as the cells multiplied, a massive scientific problem arose: HeLa contamination. Because the cells were so aggressive, they would often outcompete and contaminate other human cell cultures in labs, sometimes years after their initial introduction. By the 1960s, it was discovered that hundreds of cell lines thought to be liver cells, kidney cells, or ovarian cells were in fact nothing more than Henrietta Lacks cells. They were unstoppable. While HeLa cells were generating millions of patents and billions in revenue, Henrietta's children grew up under immense hardship. Day, working himself to exhaustion at the steel mill, struggled to raise the children. Elsie, the developmentally disabled daughter, was institutionalized and tragically died under mysterious circumstances in 1955. The children, including Deborah Lacks, Henrietta's only daughter, grew up in a vacuum of information, haunted by their mother's death and confused about what had happened to her. They had no idea that their mother was alive in glass, a biological commodity fueling the world's most advanced research. In 1970, Dr. Guy died of pancreatic cancer, having never disclosed Henrietta's name publicly, although he had always intended to honor her with a memorial. His death left the final chapter of the HeLa story to be written by others, including a medical establishment that was beginning to grapple with its past ethical failings. The need to identify and stop HeLa contamination forced scientists to seek genetic markers from the original source. This led researchers at Johns Hopkins to trace the cells back to the Lacks family. In 1973, a geneticist named Victor McCuskey, who headed Hopkins' Division of Medical Genetics, and his team began contacting Henrietta's living relatives. They did so in the same ethically murky manner that the cells were taken, without full disclosure. Researchers called the Lacks home and asked for blood samples to test for cancer. They told Day and the children that their mother's cells were famous, but they failed to properly explain that Henrietta's cells were still alive. The Lacks family, believing the tests were necessary to see if they carried the cancer that killed their mother, willingly gave their blood. The discovery was a devastating shock. Confusion and terror. Day and the children were horrified. They believed scientists had cloned Henrietta, or that a ghostly version of her was being experimented on. They feared the scientists were taking their blood to test for the HeLa germ so they could be institutionalized like Elsie. Betrayal. They learned that a part of their mother had been used without her knowledge, and that institutions were profiting while they struggled to make ends meet and could barely afford their own medication. The HeLa myth. The scientific world knew HeLa as a tool. The Lacks family knew her as Mama, a lost loved one whose memory was being defiled. This contact ignited the Lacks family's decades-long struggle for recognition and understanding. The initial scientific contact only deepened their pain and distrust, confirming their worst fears about exploitation by the very medical system that was supposed to help them. The news of HeLa controversy and the existence of the Lacks family began to leak into the mainstream media in the mid-1970s. Reporters, some sensationalizing the story, others simply struggling to explain the complex science to a general audience, descended upon the Lacks family. The story of Henrietta Lacks became a crucial turning point in the growing debate over bioethics. Patient rights. HeLa helped establish the fundamental right of a patient to control their own tissue and information. Commercialization of the body. The immense profit generated by HeLa cells forced a reckoning with the question, should people benefit from their own biological material? Racial justice in medicine. The fact that Henrietta was a poor black woman treated at a segregated hospital underscored the deep historical pattern of using marginalized bodies for research without consent or benefit. The Lacks family, still largely uneducated about the science, found themselves unprepared to navigate the ethical, legal, and media landscape. Deborah Lacks became the reluctant, fierce guardian of her mother's story. She spent her life haunted by the ghost of HeLa, constantly searching for answers about the woman she lost and the cells that lived on. She carried a single, tattered photo of her mother and yearned to understand the source of her mother's immortality. It took nearly a decade for the Lacks family story to find its proper chronicler, Rebecca Sklote. A young science journalist, Sklote became obsessed with Henrietta's story after hearing about her in a biology class. She recognized that the true story wasn't just about the cells, it was about the woman and her family. Sklote pursued the Lacks family for years, driven by a deep sense of ethical duty to tell Henrietta's complete story. She finally connected with Deborah Lacks in the 1990s, who was initially guarded and deeply skeptical of another white person seeking to exploit her family's legacy. Their relationship, detailed exhaustively in Sklote's monumental book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, was fraught but ultimately transformative. Sklote's commitment to telling the story from Deborah's perspective, her spiritual beliefs, her struggles with anxiety and grief, and her search for her long-dead mother finally broke down the barriers.
Seeking a way to understand her mother's enduring life in science and to find meaning in the tragedy, embarked on a journey with Sklote. They traveled to Johns Hopkins, met with scientists, examined the actual HeLa cells under a microscope, and visited the infamous Crownsville State Hospital where Elsie had died. This journey of discovery was Deborah's path to reconciliation with her mother's invisible life. Sklote's book, published in 2010, became an international phenomenon. It accomplished what decades of media scrutiny and scientific acknowledgement had failed to do. It humanized HeLa. It forced the scientific world to reckon with the fact that their most vital tool was a woman named Henrietta, and her descendants were suffering. The revelations catalyzed significant changes. Public acknowledgement. Johns Hopkins Hospital issued extensive statements acknowledging Henrietta Lacks, expressing regret for the lack of consent, and highlighting the positive changes in ethical procedures. The Henrietta Lacks Foundation, established by Skloot, provided financial support to Henrietta's descendants for education and health care, directly addressing the irony of the Lacks family's poverty. The NIH data control in 2013. After researchers published the full HeLa genome sequence without the family's consent, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, took an unprecedented step. They entered into an agreement with the Lacks family, giving 2 of Henrietta's descendants a role on an NIH committee to review and approve all applications for controlled access to the HeLa genome sequence data. This was a monumental shift toward data governance and patient autonomy. The story became mandatory reading in medical schools, bioethics programs, and history courses across the United States, cementing Henrietta Lacks's role not just as a medical marvel, but as an ethical cautionary tale. Henrietta Lacks's story is a perpetual living history. Her cells continued to divide, replicate, and contribute to nearly every major medical advance today, including research into COVID-19 and gene therapy. Her story is a perfect metaphor for the historical inequities of the American healthcare system, a system that could steal from a black woman in a segregated ward to save the world, yet deny her children basic care. The Lacks family, led by Henrietta's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, has finally achieved their true goal: recognition and respect. Henrietta Lacks now has a headstone. She has been honored by the U.S. Congress, universities, and international organizations. She is no longer just HeLa, but Henrietta, the woman whose sacrifice, though unconsented, fundamentally changed the course of medical history. Her life asks us the enduring question: if science benefits from the body, shouldn't the person benefit from the science? The world may never fully repay the debt owed to Henrietta Lacks, but her story ensures that her name, her legacy, and her humanity will never again be erased.